Hello and welcome to another video review. This is the Journeyman Project for PC and Mac. Now I imagine you're wondering why there are still images instead of gameplay footage, and I will tell you why in a moment. It is an unfortunate circumstance. But this was developed by Presto Studios and published in 1993, first for Mac and then for Windows 3.1. They re-released it the following year as the Journeyman Project Turbo, which was basically just version 2.0. Had a bunch of speed improvements, hence the name Turbo. And these speed improvements were required, because the game ran like crap. It was that simple. It just ran like crap when it came out. So, they re-released it as Turbo. That's what I've got. They re-released it again as the Journeyman Project Pegasus Prime in 1997, using actors from Journeyman Project 2 Buried in Time, as well as that particular interface, much better graphics, that sort of thing. Only one problem. That was for Mac, and only Mac. There was a PlayStation and a Sega Saturn version planned, but they never actually made those. So, if you have a Mac, you can probably find Pegasus Prime and actually play it. Good luck trying. I mean, it might still not work, but I've seen people actually say they can play Pegasus Prime on more modern Macs, so you should be able to do something with that. But for the Windows 3.1 people, we're screwed. We can't play it. At least, I've never been able to find a way to play it. Nothing I have ever done has worked. I've tried running it in every compatibility mode I can. It just won't work on modern hardware, modern operating systems. It did work on Windows 95 and 98 back in the day, but barely. So, it was a mess. Anyway, that's why you don't have gameplay footage. Sorry, I can't put up gameplay footage. Like I said, if you figured out a way to run it on modern hardware, let me know. But I'm going to go into what I can about this particular game. As far as presentation goes, it was pretty impressive for its time. The CG effects were surprisingly well detailed. There was a lot of smoothness in the animations. Pretty high quality stuff, actually. It also had FMV sequences that admittedly weren't anywhere near as good, but they were okay. They actually did what they needed to do, and they weren't just awful FMV sequences. There were a lot of FMV games back then, and almost all of them were bad, because the FMV was just terrible for one thing, but the gameplay was bad as well. And so, to have this high-quality visual stuff going on with this particular game, even though it is really low-res, and on more modern monitors and such, it'll look really stretched out if you actually manage to get it working. But it's pretty impressive to see that they actually put this amount of detail into this game. And it's especially nice considering that the style of everything is very futuristic, so you kind of have to be able to make out details and things to actually understand what it does. And it's kind of cool to see what different things can be interacted with. It actually blends in with the environment pretty well until you actually manage to interact with the stuff. Then there's the sound design, which is Most of the sound effects are okay, but not particularly impressive. You do have a few that are really, really loud compared to others, and that's actually pretty annoying. It kind of hurts your ears, especially if you're wearing headphones. But most of the sounds do what they need to do, and that's kind of all they really are meant to do. The acting is, both in FMV and in voice acting, is surprisingly good as well. The computerized voices aside, of course, because those are just pretty ridiculous anyway, and they're meant to be. But the actual acting in this game is pretty good, actually. So you have that, you have the sound effects that do their job. The music is it's kind of this discovery music going on. It works okay, but it's not particularly impressive either. It does have really short loops that just kind of keep going and going and going, so it'll get on your nerves after a while. But ultimately, that doesn't really matter. It's not all about the presentation. Now, what really matter are the story and the gameplay, although the story itself is pretty weird because it deals with time travel. You play as someone named Agent 5. You don't actually get a name in this particular one. In the original release, that just wasn't the case. But in Pegasus Prime, they did change that to be more fitting with the rest of the games in the series. Just something to bear in mind. But you are a member of the Temporal Security Agency. It is currently the 24th century, and you go into work one day to find that there's a temporal rip. And a temporal rip means that something in the past has been changed, and the ripple effect is going to come in and just screw up the present. So, what ends up happening is you have to go back in time to actually figure out not only what was changed, but also you had to fix it. So it's pretty interesting to actually go and fiddle between these different time periods because it's all set in the future, but it's different parts of the future, different bits, like first contact with aliens, for instance, or a rally to try to say, hey, we should join this symbiote of peaceful beings that the aliens offered to us. And, of course, other things as well, but you had to go back in time to actually fix these things. And sometimes you have to get something from one time period and take it to another in order to fix something in that particular time period. And it's kind of weird how this game ends up working out. You actually do have a couple of ways you can solve certain puzzles. You can be peaceful or aggressive in taking out certain tasks. So that'll actually affect your score at the end of the game. One thing I really have to say about this thing, its interface is really hard to get used to. Because it involves a lot of click and drag, and you have to use a lot of biochips and as well as items. It's just a mess. And so it's kind of hard to figure out what you need to do in order to play this game at first. Once you get used to it, it's not as bad, but it's still a pretty clunky interface, and they did improve it in the sequels. Anyway, it's just a kind of a convoluted mess in terms of the gameplay, just figuring out what you actually fiddle around with. But the puzzles themselves are the major problem I had with this game, because at the same time they're both clever and infuriating. Infuriating because it may take you a really long time to actually figure out what you need to do. And clever because both that and it's sometimes solutions you just wouldn't think of normally. So this game does actually kind of make you think outside the box. It thinks, hey, maybe this solution isn't as obvious as it looks. Maybe it's something a little bit more subtle than that. So you might need to go and do something else and then come back and say, hey, this actually did do something to this. And so the game itself is actually pretty confusing when you're playing it. It really helps to have a walkthrough of sorts, or some sort of visual thing to tell you what you need to fiddle around with, what the issues are that you'll need to be aware of, because it's really easy to die in this game. And I mean, you will be dying a lot. It's that simple. You will just die constantly. So it's hard. It is legitimately hard. And for an adventure game, that's something pretty just unusual. I mean, you had a few in the 90s that were, in the 80s, that were hard, but by and large, they were pretty easy once you knew what to do. Even in even when you know what to do in Journeyman Project, it's still actually pretty hard to do, because your timing has to be on and such. So it's got a pretty interesting challenge to it. I don't know about Pegasus Prime, but the original game was actually the hardest in the series, at least as far as I've played so far. Like I said, haven't played Pegasus Prime yet. But I have to say, it's also the weakest of the series. Despite being the most challenging, it's also the weakest. It's not very fun to play. It's interesting, and the story gets you intrigued as you're going along. But as far as the gameplay goes, it's just not fun. It's a challenge that doesn't really register in your brain very well. You sit there and you're like, okay, I like the story. I like that it's kind of just unfolding around me as I go through it, and everything's becoming more and more clear. But these puzzles are awful. So that's pretty much how the whole game is. If you can put up with the awful puzzles, you'll be treated to a surprisingly good time-traveling adventure. But, again, you have to put up with those puzzles. And also you have to put up with the massive amount of technical problems that you will have from trying to run this thing on modern hardware. So good luck with that if you're going to do that. Thanks for watching.